Hello, my dear friends. In ancient Egypt, life was closely tied to nature, the Nile, and the passing of seasons. Relationships between men and women were understood as part of this natural order. Sex was not treated only as a private act, but as something connected to family, fertility, religion, and daily survival. It was not surrounded by the same silence or shame found in some later societies. Instead, it was spoken about in simple and practical ways, because producing children and continuing the family line were important parts of life. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not arranged through large public ceremonies as it would be in later times. A man and a woman were considered married when they chose to live together and form a household. There was usually no temple ritual or priest involved. Instead, marriage was recognized through family agreement and shared property. Sex within marriage was expected and accepted because children were needed to work the land, carry on family names, and care for parents in old age. A household without children was seen as incomplete. Ancient Egyptian art and writing show that physical closeness between husbands and wives was not hidden. Tomb paintings show couples sitting close together, touching hands or shoulders. Love poems written on papyrus describe desire using gentle images like flowers, perfume, and cool water. These poems do not describe the act itself in detail. Instead, they focus on longing, beauty, and the joy of being near another person. This suggests that emotional connection and physical desire were seen as part of the same experience. Fertility was deeply important in Egyptian belief. The gods themselves were linked to reproduction and creation. Osiris, Isis, Hathor, and Min were all connected to birth, growth, and sexual power. Statues and symbols showed these ideas openly, not in a graphic way, but as signs of life energy. Sex was understood as one of the forces that kept the universe in balance, just like the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile. Contraception was known and used in simple forms. Medical texts describe mixtures made from honey, plant fibers, and other natural materials that were placed inside the body to reduce the chance of pregnancy. These methods were not always effective, but they show that people thought carefully about when and how often to have children. Sex was not only about reproduction, it was also about pleasure and companionship. Women in ancient Egypt had more rights than in many later societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and ask for divorce. This meant that relationships were not entirely controlled by men. A woman who was unhappy could leave a marriage and take her belongings with her. This legal freedom suggests that sexual relationships were expected to involve some level of mutual agreement, not only duty. There were also rules. Adultery was strongly disapproved of, especially for women. It was seen as a threat to family order and inheritance. Children needed to be clearly linked to one household and one father. For this reason, loyalty within marriage was important. While love poems suggest passion and desire, law texts show that society valued stability over excitement. Sex outside marriage existed, but it was not celebrated. Servants, workers, and travelers formed temporary relationships, especially in cities. These were part of real life, but they did not carry the same respect as family unions. Prostitution also existed, though it was not organized in the same way as in later periods. There is little evidence of large brothels. Instead, sexual exchange happened quietly, without formal structure. The body itself was not treated as sinful. Egyptians bathed often and used perfumes and oils. Cleanliness was linked to beauty and health. Clothing was light and made from linen, suited to the warm climate. Nudity was not always sexual. Workers and children were often shown without much clothing in art. This does not mean society was careless, but that the body was seen as part of everyday life, rather than something hidden. Education about sex was not formal, but it came through observation and family teaching. Young people learned about relationships by watching married couples and listening to stories. There were no separate spaces for instruction. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next, mixed with religious ideas and practical advice. So in ancient Egypt, sex was not surrounded by fear or secrecy. It was part of marriage, part of religion, and part of the rhythm of life. It carried rules, but it also carried meaning beyond reproduction. It connected people to each other and to the gods who represented creation itself. And as this first part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt comes to rest, we see that it was neither hidden nor wild. It was shaped by family, law, belief, and daily survival. It existed quietly inside homes, poems, and rituals, woven into the structure of ordinary life beside the Nile. Beyond marriage and poetry, daily life in ancient Egypt shaped how intimacy was practiced and understood. Homes were small and often shared by many family members, which meant privacy was limited. A married couple did not usually have a separate bedroom as later societies would imagine. Instead, intimacy happened quietly within the household, often at night when work was finished and lamps burned low. This closeness of living space made sex feel like part of ordinary family life rather than something separate from it. The seasons of the Nile also influenced relationships. When the river flooded, farming work slowed. People stayed closer to home, repairing tools and waiting for the waters to fall. This time of rest and waiting increased time spent together inside houses. Many scholars believe that birth patterns followed the rhythm of the river, with more children born after the flood season. In this way, nature guided human intimacy without written rules. Pregnancy and childbirth were important events, surrounded by both practical care and religious belief. Women prayed to goddesses such as Taweret and Hathor for protection during pregnancy. Small amulets were worn on the body to guard against danger. Sex during pregnancy was not forbidden, but it was treated with caution and ritual awareness. Health texts suggest that couples were advised to avoid strain and to respect the body's condition during this time. Medical knowledge about reproduction existed in simple form. Papyrus texts describe signs of pregnancy, and even early tests using grain seeds and urine to predict whether a woman was with child. These ideas show that people observed patterns and tried to understand the body in practical ways. Sex was therefore linked not only to desire, but also to health and careful planning. Men and women were expected to play different roles within intimacy. Men were seen as providers and protectors of the household. Women were seen as caretakers of children and home. Yet both were needed for family stability. Love poems describe women expressing desire and choosing partners, suggesting that attraction was not only decided by men. Emotional connection mattered alongside physical union. Religion continued to shape attitudes. Myths of the gods included stories of creation through union. The god Adam was said to create the first gods through his own body. Isis restored Osiris through devotion and ritual. These stories did not describe acts in detail, but they connected intimacy with cosmic order. Sex was therefore understood as a force of creation rather than only a personal act. Festivals also reflected this belief. During celebrations of fertility gods, people sang songs and carried symbols of growth and renewal. These events did not involve public sexual acts, but they openly acknowledged the power of reproduction and attraction. The community shared in these symbols, making intimacy part of social life rather than something hidden away. Moral limits still existed. Sexual harm and force were condemned in legal texts. Respect for family structure was central. A man who took another man's wife disrupted inheritance and order. This was treated seriously because it threatened the balance of society. Sex was acceptable when it supported family and continuity. It was criticized when it caused conflict or uncertainty. Servants and workers lived under different pressures. Many were separated from families for long periods while working on temples or royal projects. Temporary relationships formed in these communities. These were often tolerated, but not officially recognized. Children born from such unions sometimes joined the mother's household or became workers themselves. Their status depended more on family support than on the act that created them. Art continued to show affection in calm ways. Couples are carved sitting close, arms touching. This closeness suggests warmth rather than secrecy. The absence of fear in these images tells us that intimacy was not treated as shameful. It was a sign of harmony between people and the gods. So sex in ancient Egypt existed within a clear structure of family, belief, and nature. It was guided by the Nile's rhythm, by law, and by religious meaning. It was not only about pleasure or duty, it was about balance, continuity, and connection between human life and the larger world around it. And as this second part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into quiet reflection, we see that what truly mattered was not the act itself, but the role it played in keeping life moving forward. Through marriage, birth, and belief, sex became part of the same cycle that raised crops, shaped families, and honored the gods who watched over the river and the land. As intimacy continued to shape family life, it also shaped ideas about beauty and attraction. Ancient Egyptians paid close attention to the body, not in a hidden or forbidden way, but in a practical and aesthetic one. Both men and women used oils and perfumes made from flowers and plants. These were not only for scent, but also for skin care and protection from the sun. Clean skin and pleasant smell were signs of health and order. Attraction was linked to cleanliness and care, rather than to secrecy or display. Hairstyles and simple cosmetics played a role in how people presented themselves to partners. Kohl was used around the eyes by both men and women, partly for beauty and partly to protect against glare and insects. Wigs were worn on special occasions. These choices were not made only for others to see. They were part of how a person felt prepared to meet the world, including a spouse. Intimacy was therefore connected to daily habits of washing, dressing, and preparing the body. Age and life stage mattered in relationships. Most marriages took place when people were young, often in their late teens. Life expectancy was shorter than in modern times, so families formed early. Sexual life began within marriage and was expected to lead to children soon. A woman who did not become pregnant could face social pressure, not because desire was wrong, but because fertility was valued so highly. In such cases, couples turned to prayer, medicine, and ritual, rather than blame alone. The home was the main space for intimacy. Houses were built with simple rooms and flat roofs. In warmer months, people slept on roofs to catch the breeze. This meant that intimacy often happened in quiet corners or late at night when others were asleep. Privacy was created by time rather than by walls. The rhythm of work and rest shaped when couples were together. Texts also suggest that humor and play were part of relationships. Some love poems include teasing words and light images of pursuit and meeting. These do not describe the act itself, but they show that attraction was not only serious or sacred, it could be joyful and gentle. This tells us that intimacy was part of emotional life, not only duty. There were differences between social classes. Wealthy households had more space and more servants, which allowed greater privacy. They also had access to better oils, clothing, and medical knowledge. Poorer families lived closer together and worked longer hours. Their intimacy was shaped by fatigue and by shared living space. Yet the basic meaning of relationships was similar across classes. Family, fertility, and household stability mattered at every level. Foreign influence also played a role over time. As Egypt traded and fought with other lands, new ideas entered the country. During later periods when Greeks and Romans ruled Egypt, attitudes toward the body and desire slowly mixed with Egyptian traditions. Yet older beliefs about fertility and order remained strong. Sex continued to be linked to creation and balance, rather than to sin. Legal records show that disputes over marriage and children were treated seriously. A woman could bring a case if a man refused to support her or their children. Contracts sometimes listed what a husband owed his wife, including food and clothing. This suggests that sexual relationships carried legal and economic weight. They were not only personal matters, they shaped property and inheritance. Illness and aging also changed intimacy. As bodies weakened, desire did not disappear, but it took different forms. Companionship became more important than fertility. Older couples were shown sitting together in art, suggesting closeness beyond youth. Intimacy was therefore not only for the young, it was part of long life when possible. The idea of shame was not central to Egyptian thinking about the body. There were rules and limits, but the body itself was not seen as dirty. Bathing was common. Clothing was light. Nudity in certain settings, like work or childhood, was normal. This does not mean society had no boundaries, but it means that intimacy was not built on hiding the body. It was built on placing it within order. So sex in ancient Egypt was shaped by beauty, health, law, and belief. It happened within small houses and large ideas. It was guided by the Nile's seasons and by the gods who ruled creation. It was neither wild nor silent. It was part of how people understood life continuing from one generation to the next. And as this third part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt comes to rest, we see that relationships were woven into everyday actions. Washing, dressing, praying, and working all prepared people for family life. Intimacy was not a separate world. It was part of the same pattern that guided farming, worship, and home. In this way, sex was not only about two people, it was about keeping balance in a world shaped by river, sun, and belief. As relationships continued through adulthood, intimacy also became connected to duty and continuity. Marriage was not only about two people, it was about joining families and securing the future of a household. Property, tools, and livestock were passed down through children, so sexual relationships were tied closely to inheritance. Because of this, the act of forming a family carried social meaning beyond private life. A stable couple meant a stable home, and a stable home meant order within the village. Contracts written on papyrus sometimes described the obligations of husband and wife. These documents could include promises of food, clothing, and support. While they did not describe intimacy directly, they showed that marriage was treated as a serious agreement. Sex within this bond was expected to produce children, but it was also part of companionship. The language of these contracts suggests responsibility rather than passion, showing that intimacy was linked to care and duty as much as to desire. Widowhood and remarriage were common because life was uncertain. Disease, accidents, and hard labor often took lives early. A woman who lost her husband could remarry without shame. A man who lost his wife was expected to find another partner to manage the household and raise children. Sexual life, therefore, was not frozen by loss. It moved forward as part of survival. Emotional attachment mattered, but practical needs guided new unions. There is evidence that pleasure was not ignored. Love poems speak of closeness, warmth, and waiting for a loved one. These poems were copied and shared, showing that they were valued. They do not describe physical acts in detail, but they describe feelings of attraction and comfort. This suggests that intimacy was understood as something that brought joy as well as children. The heart and the body were not separated in Egyptian thinking. Health and fertility were closely linked to intimacy. Women used simple remedies to help conception, such as special drinks or amulets. Men also took part in rituals meant to increase strength and fertility. These practices mixed medicine and religion, showing that the body and the divine were believed to work together. Sex was seen as successful not only when it brought pleasure, but when it brought life. There were boundaries that protected family order. Incest within close family was forbidden, except in royal families where it was used to keep power within one line. Among common people, marriage followed clear rules of kinship. These limits show that even though the body was not considered shameful, relationships were controlled by law and custom. Sex had a place, and that place was inside accepted bonds. Royal life followed some of the same patterns, but with greater symbolism. Pharaohs were seen as linked to the gods, and their unions carried religious meaning. Queens were often shown beside kings in art, touching or standing close. These images represented both political and fertile power. The king's ability to produce heirs was part of his role as ruler. Intimacy at the top of society was tied to stability of the state itself. Daily workers experienced intimacy in simpler ways. Their days were long and physical. Evenings were short. Relationships grew from shared labor and shared meals. There was little room for elaborate ceremony. A man and woman became a couple by living together and caring for a home. Their intimacy was shaped by fatigue and routine rather than by ritual. The passing of years changed how people thought about desire. Youth brought urgency because children were needed quickly. Later life brought calm, as households were already formed. Older couples are shown sitting quietly together in tomb art, suggesting companionship rather than passion. This shows that intimacy was seen as something that changed with time rather than disappearing. Death itself was connected to ideas of life and union. Tomb texts speak of rejoining loved ones in the afterlife. The hope of meeting again suggests that bonds formed in life were believed to continue beyond death. In this way, Intimacy was not only part of the living world, it was part of how people imagined eternity. So sex in ancient Egypt was not a hidden or wild force. It was shaped by law, belief, health, and daily work. It supported family structure and religious order. It moved from youth to age, from desire to duty, from private life into hope for the afterlife. And as this fourth part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that relationships were built on balance. The body, the family, and the gods were all part of the same system. Intimacy did not stand apart from life. It stood inside it, quietly helping the world continue from one generation to the next. As life continued along the Nile, intimacy also became tied to ideas of loyalty and harmony within the household. Ancient Egyptians believed strongly in balance, which they called ma'at. This idea shaped how people treated each other, including in marriage. A peaceful home was seen as a sign that order existed not only in the world, but inside the family. Sexual relationships were therefore expected to support calm and stability rather than conflict. Quarrels between partners were viewed as signs that harmony had been disturbed. Trust between husband and wife mattered because it protected inheritance and family identity. Children were not only loved, they were needed to carry names, property, and duties forward. Because of this, women were expected to know clearly who their children belonged to, and men were expected to provide for them. This made intimacy part of a larger chain linking past generations to future ones. Sex was not just about the present moment. It was about keeping the family line unbroken. There is also evidence that laughter and play existed within relationships. Some figurines and carvings show couples in relaxed poses, sharing food or sitting close. These scenes suggest everyday comfort rather than ceremony. They show that intimacy was woven into daily life in gentle ways, shaped by companionship as much as by reproduction. A shared meal, a shared bed, and shared work all blended together inside the small Egyptian home. Music and dance sometimes played a role in attraction. At festivals, people sang and moved together, celebrating gods linked to fertility and joy. These gatherings allowed young people to meet and form bonds. While strict rules of marriage still existed, these moments of music and movement allowed desire to appear naturally within accepted space. Intimacy grew from shared celebration as much as from family arrangement. The body was prepared for closeness through routine care. Oils protected skin from dryness and heat. Simple jewelry highlighted the face and neck. Clean linen clothing allowed the body to feel light and free. These habits were not only about beauty, they were about respect for oneself and for one's partner. A clean and cared-for body was seen as a sign of order and health. Age and fertility remained important, but affection did not vanish with time. Tomb art often shows older couples sitting side by side, touching hands. These images were meant to show that the bond formed in life continued after death. They did not focus on youth or desire, but on closeness and shared existence. Intimacy, in this sense, became a symbol of unity rather than passion alone. Religious belief continued to guide understanding. Gods and goddesses were shown as married pairs, and their unions were said to bring life into the world. This gave human relationships a model to follow. When people came together as partners, they believed they were reflecting divine order on earth. Sex, therefore, was not separated from worship. It was quietly linked to it through story and symbol. Shame around the body was limited. Clothing was practical and light. Children often ran without heavy garments. Workers labored in little more than simple cloth. The body was not hidden from sight, but its use was guided by custom. Intimacy belonged in the home, but the body itself belonged in the world. This difference allowed people to see sex as natural without making it public. Conflict and jealousy did exist, as they do in all societies. Stories and legal texts mention disputes over loyalty and support, yet the goal of these laws was not to punish desire, but to protect order. Sex was not judged as evil. It was judged by how it affected family and peace within the household. So in ancient Egypt, sex was shaped by balance, by care for the body, and by long-term connection. It was part of music and work, of marriage and belief. It was guided by the need for children and the wish for companionship. It did not stand apart from life. It moved quietly within it, following the same rhythm as the river and the seasons. And as this fifth part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into stillness, we see that relationships were built on harmony more than on secrecy. The body, the family, and the gods were linked through daily actions. Intimacy was one thread in a larger pattern of order that stretched from the home to the temple and from one generation to the next. Within this balanced world of family and belief, intimacy also touched questions of identity and personal worth. A person's role as husband or wife shaped how they were seen by neighbors and by their own family. To be part of a couple was to be part of a recognized unit inside society. This gave people a place within the order of the village, linking their private life to public respect. Sexual relationships, therefore, were not hidden acts, but quiet foundations of social belonging, even though they took place inside the home. The language used in love poems and everyday speech shows that desire was spoken of through nature rather than through the body alone. Lovers compared each other to gardens, flowers, and fresh water. These images placed attraction inside the same world as farming and seasons. The body was not separated from nature. It was treated as another living part of it. This way of speaking suggests that intimacy felt ordinary and understandable, not strange or forbidden. Illness and infertility created moments of worry inside this system. When children did not come, couples sought help from healers and from the gods. Remedies mixed plants with prayer. Amulets were worn close to the skin. Certain days were chosen for closeness because they were thought to be favorable. These actions show that sex was linked to hope as much as to pleasure. It was part of a search for continuity, guided by belief as well as by the body. The position of women shaped how intimacy was practiced. Because women could own property and leave unhappy marriages, their consent carried weight. A man who mistreated his wife risked losing both her and the household stability she provided. This did not mean that all marriages were equal or gentle, but it meant that intimacy was not entirely one-sided. It existed within a structure where women had recognized rights, which influenced how relationships were formed and maintained. Children learned about these patterns not through instruction, but through daily observation. They saw parents working together, sharing food, and sleeping under the same roof. They grew up understanding that closeness belonged inside family life. There were no separate lessons about desire. Knowledge came from watching how adults behaved and how households were built. In this way, intimacy was passed down quietly as part of normal living. Class differences continued to shape experience. Wealthy families had servants who allowed them more time and space together. Poorer families shared rooms and slept close to others. Yet in both cases, intimacy was guided by routine rather than by privacy alone. The difference lay in comfort, not in meaning. Whether rich or poor, people understood closeness as something tied to home and family. The royal court reflected these ideas in symbolic ways. Pharaohs were shown with queens to display fertility and strength. Their union was not only personal but political. It suggested that the land itself would continue to prosper. This image of divine and human union reinforced the belief that sexual harmony supported the wider world. Intimacy at the highest level mirrored intimacy in ordinary homes, both linked to order and continuity. Time changed relationships as bodies aged. Desire softened into companionship. Touch became quieter. Art from tombs shows older couples seated side by side rather than standing apart. These images were meant to show lasting unity rather than youth. They suggest that intimacy was not only about the beginning of life, but also about remaining together until the end. Death did not break this idea. Tomb texts often speak of meeting loved ones again in the afterlife. The hope of reunion shows that bonds formed in life were believed to survive beyond the body. Sexual and emotional connection thus became part of eternity, not only of the present world. The household on earth was linked to a household beyond death. Daily routine kept these beliefs alive. Cooking, washing, working, and resting all prepared space for closeness. Intimacy did not interrupt life. It followed its rhythm. It arrived after labor and before sleep. It lived beside prayer and within family duty. This made it steady rather than dramatic, woven into the pattern of ordinary days. So in ancient Egypt, sex was not isolated from the rest of existence. It was tied to beauty, to belief, to health, and to time. It carried meaning through marriage, through birth, and through memory. It was shaped by the same order that guided rivers and stars. It was neither hidden nor uncontrolled. It moved quietly within the structure of society, helping families continue and helping the world feel balanced. Within this steady rhythm of household life, intimacy also shaped how people understood loyalty and trust. Marriage created a bond that was meant to last, not only for emotional reasons, but for practical survival. Fields, tools, and homes depended on two people working together. Because of this, closeness between partners was linked to cooperation. A couple that shared work easily also shared their private life more peacefully. In Egyptian thinking, harmony in one part of life supported harmony in all others. Jealousy and conflict were known, but they were treated as dangers to order rather than as signs of passion. Legal texts show that disputes between partners could be brought before local courts, especially when property or children were involved. These records do not speak of desire in detail, but they show that sexual relationships had consequences beyond feelings. A broken bond could mean a broken household, and that affected the wider community. The idea of modesty existed, but it was different from later meanings. Clothing covered the body for protection from heat and sun more than for moral reasons. Linen garments were light and often simple. Workers and children were sometimes shown with little clothing in art, not to suggest desire but to show everyday activity. Intimacy was not defined by hiding the body, but by placing closeness inside the home rather than in public space. Symbols of fertility appeared often in ordinary objects. Amulets shaped like plants, animals, or protective figures were worn close to the skin. These were meant to guard pregnancy and childbirth, but they also reflected how strongly reproduction was tied to belief. A couple's closeness was thought to be watched over by divine forces, making intimacy part of religion even when it happened in silence. Festivals strengthened these ideas. During celebrations of gods linked to growth and renewal, people sang songs about love and beauty. These songs were not descriptions of acts. They were expressions of longing and union. By placing such words in public celebration, society showed that desire itself was not forbidden. It was accepted when it supported life and order. Foreign visitors to Egypt sometimes wrote about these customs with surprise. Compared to stricter societies, Egyptians appeared relaxed about the body and affection. Yet this did not mean there were no limits. Relationships still had rules, and those rules were tied to family structure and inheritance. The openness of art and poetry existed alongside careful control of who could form a household and how children were named. The position of servants and laborers created another layer. Many lived away from their families for long periods while working on royal projects or temples. Temporary unions formed in these groups, especially among young workers. These relationships were shaped by distance and need rather than by ceremony. Children born from such unions usually followed the mother's status and household. This shows that intimacy adapted to conditions of labor and movement. Medical texts continued to record practical knowledge. They described ways to predict pregnancy and methods thought to prevent it. These writings were simple and based on observation. They show that people tried to manage their reproductive lives rather than leaving everything to chance. Sex was therefore part of planning as well as part of feeling. Age brought changes in how people saw desire. In youth, closeness was linked to starting a family. In middle life, it was tied to maintaining one. In old age, it became part of companionship and shared memory. Art and writing support this view by showing couples together at many stages of life. Intimacy was not limited to one season. It followed the whole path of human time. Death did not fully end these bonds in belief. Tomb images of couples seated together suggest that the household continued in another form. The hope of reunion after death gave weight to relationships formed in life. Intimacy was not only about the present body, it was about connection that reached beyond it. So sex in ancient Egypt existed inside a wide circle of meaning. It was part of work, part of law, part of belief, and part of time. It was guided by the need for children and by the wish for harmony. It did not stand apart from ordinary life. It moved quietly through it like the river itself, carrying families from one generation to the next. As these ideas of harmony and continuity remained strong, intimacy also became connected to reputation and social standing. A household that appeared stable was respected. Neighbors judged families not by private moments, but by outward signs, such as how children behaved, how partners spoke to one another, and whether disputes reached public attention. In this way, sexual relationships were linked to public image without being publicly displayed. What happened inside the home shaped how that home was seen by others. Education about relationships continued quietly through custom rather than instruction. Young people learned what was expected by watching married couples, hearing songs at festivals, and listening to stories told by elders. These stories did not explain physical acts. They explained loyalty, patience, and cooperation. Desire was understood as something natural that needed to be guided into accepted paths rather than suppressed or celebrated without limit. The balance between pleasure and responsibility remained central. Love poems show waiting, longing, and delight in closeness, but they also suggest patience and care. Desire was not shown as something that rushed forward without thought. It was shaped by time, seasons, and readiness. In this way, intimacy was part of planning a future rather than escaping from the present. The idea of beauty itself was linked to health and fertility. A well-cared-for body was seen as a sign of strength and order. Oils protected skin, perfumes cooled the heat, and simple jewelry marked important parts of the body such as the neck and wrists. These habits were not meant to provoke attention, but to show that a person belonged inside the system of care and balance. Attraction followed these signs of stability rather than wild display. Different regions of Egypt showed small differences in custom. In larger cities, where many people lived close together, relationships were shaped by crowding and movement. In rural villages, life moved more slowly, and family ties were stronger. Yet in both places, intimacy followed the same basic ideas. It belonged inside household life, and it supported continuity. Local habits changed the surface of relationships, but not their meaning. Foreign rule in later periods introduced new ideas about the body and desire. Greek and Roman customs mixed with Egyptian ones. Some writings from these later times describe Egyptian openness with curiosity or misunderstanding. Yet, even as outside influence grew, the older beliefs about fertility and order remained. Sex continued to be linked to the gods of creation and to the cycle of nature, rather than to ideas of sin. The legal protection of women also continued to shape intimacy. Because a woman could own property and seek separation if mistreated, her position inside a relationship was not only symbolic, it had practical strength. This did not remove inequality, but it meant that intimacy could not exist entirely without agreement. The structure of law quietly supported balance within the household. In times of hardship such as famine or disease, intimacy took on a different meaning. Couples delayed having children when food was scarce. Remedies meant to prevent pregnancy were used more carefully. This shows that sex was part of survival planning as well as emotional life. It responded to conditions rather than ignoring them. Art continued to reflect these values without showing acts themselves. Couples appear together in relaxed poses, sometimes with children nearby. These images suggest that intimacy was seen as a foundation of family rather than as an event to be isolated. The focus remained on connection rather than on movement or detail. The passing of generations slowly changed how people remembered their own youth. Older men and women spoke of the early days of their marriage with quiet pride. Their stories did not describe desire in physical terms. They described shared work, shared food, and shared sleep. Intimacy became part of memory, woven into long years of living rather than remembered as separate moments. Belief in the afterlife continued to give weight to these bonds. Tomb inscriptions often wished that couples would be reunited. This hope turned earthly closeness into eternal unity. Sex and affection were not only part of temporary life. They were seen as part of a larger journey beyond death. So in ancient Egypt, intimacy was shaped by reputation, law, health, and belief. It was not hidden, but it was not displayed. It lived inside routine, inside marriage, and inside the hope of continuity. It followed the rhythm of the Nile and the rhythm of family life, changing with age and season but always returning to the same purpose of balance. And as this eighth part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that sex was understood as one thread in a wider pattern. It tied together beauty and duty, desire and law, body and belief. It did not break the order of life. It helped hold that order in place, quietly guiding one generation into the next. Over long periods of time, these patterns of intimacy became part of how society judged maturity and responsibility. To form a household was to step fully into adult life. A man who married and produced children was seen as stable and useful to the community. A woman who managed a home and raised children was respected for keeping order within it. Sexual life was therefore closely linked to social status, because it marked the point at which a person became part of the larger structure of village and family, rather than remaining only an individual. The language used in everyday speech reflected this view. Words for marriage and union were often connected to ideas of building and joining. A couple was spoken of as forming a house rather than merely sharing a bed. This shows that intimacy was understood as a creative act that produced not only children, but also a working unit within society. Sex was one step in the making of a household, not an isolated act without consequence. The role of men in these relationships was tied to provision and protection. A husband was expected to supply food, clothing, and shelter. His closeness with his wife was part of this duty because it supported the future of the family. If he failed in these tasks, the bond itself could be questioned. In this way, intimacy was linked to responsibility rather than to freedom alone. Women's roles were shaped by both motherhood and partnership. A wife was not only a bearer of children, but also a manager of daily life inside the home. Her position gave her influence over how the household ran. This meant that sexual life was connected to authority in small ways. A stable union gave a woman security and voice within her family. Intimacy, therefore, supported her place in society, as well as her personal life. In religious thinking, this household model reflected the divine world. Gods were often shown in family groups, with fathers, mothers, and children forming small divine households. Human families were seen as reflections of these divine examples. Sexual union within marriage was thus understood as copying a pattern set by the gods themselves. This belief made intimacy part of sacred order even when it happened in ordinary rooms. The passing of time strengthened these ideas. A couple that remained together for many years became a symbol of success. Their grown children and working household showed that their bond had been fruitful. Such families were remembered in tombs and inscriptions, where husbands and wives are often named together. Their unity was meant to last beyond death, showing that intimacy was believed to create lasting ties. Periods of political change did not fully alter these beliefs. When new rulers came, or when foreign customs entered Egypt, older traditions about family and fertility remained strong. New styles of clothing or language might appear, but the core idea of intimacy as part of order continued. Sex stayed linked to home, children, and stability rather than becoming a separate or hidden subject. Even in times of difficulty, such as disease or crop failure, these patterns held. Couples adjusted by delaying births or seeking ritual help, but they did not abandon the idea that intimacy should serve family and balance. In this way, Sexual life adapted to hardship without losing its place within society's structure. The teaching of these values did not rely on schools or written lessons for most people. It relied on example. Children saw how their parents treated each other. They saw how neighbors lived. They learned when closeness was appropriate and when restraint was expected. This made intimacy part of social learning rather than personal discovery alone. Art and writing continue to support this view by focusing on pairs rather than on individuals. Tomb walls show couples seated together, often at the same size and height, suggesting equality of presence. They are shown sharing food or standing close, not separated by distance. These images did not aim to show desire directly. They aimed to show union as a lasting state. As generations passed, intimacy became part of tradition. People did not question why marriage mattered or why children were valued. These ideas felt natural because they had been lived for so long. Sex was not discussed as a problem to be solved. It was discussed as part of how life continued. So in ancient Egypt, sexual life was woven into adulthood, family, and belief. It shaped how people were seen, how they lived, and how they hoped to be remembered. It did not stand outside society. It formed one of the quiet foundations on which society rested. And as this ninth part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that what mattered most was not the act itself, but the structure it supported. Through union, households were formed. Through households, society remained stable. In this way, sex was not only a private experience, but a link between individuals, families, and the order of the world itself. Across long stretches of history, intimacy in ancient Egypt remained closely tied to ideas of continuity and remembrance. People did not think of relationships as something that ended with the body. They believed that what was formed in life could be carried into the afterlife. This belief shaped how couples treated one another while alive. To build a stable bond was to prepare for a shared future beyond death. Tomb inscriptions often show husband and wife named together, not as separate individuals but as a single household moving into eternity. The preparation for death reflected this thinking. Burial goods included objects linked to daily life, such as beds, chairs, and household tools. These items symbolized the continuation of home and family beyond the grave. In this way, intimacy was not only part of living, but also part of dying well. A person who had formed a household and raised children was seen as complete, having fulfilled the main duties of life. Public celebrations of life stages reinforced these ideas. Birth, marriage, and the naming of children were moments when the community gathered. These events did not focus on private acts, but on their results. A new child meant that intimacy had fulfilled its purpose. A new couple meant that a new household had begun. Society paid attention to these visible signs rather than to hidden moments. The rhythm of work and rest continued to shape how closeness appeared. Long days in fields and workshops meant that evenings were quiet and short. Lamps burned low. The house grew still. Intimacy was fitted into this rhythm rather than placed above it. It did not interrupt labor. It followed it. This made it part of routine rather than something separate or dramatic. The Nile itself remained a powerful symbol. Just as the river rose and fell each year to bring new growth, relationships were seen as cycles of union and renewal. Love poems compared desire to water and plants, suggesting that attraction was as natural as irrigation and harvest. These images show how deeply intimacy was placed inside the natural world rather than outside it. Political power also borrowed these ideas. Kings presented themselves as fathers of the land and queens as mothers. Their union symbolized prosperity for the whole country. When the royal household appeared stable, the state was thought to be stable as well. Sexual and family life at the top of society thus mirrored the hopes of ordinary homes, reinforcing the same values at every level. Over centuries, customs shifted slightly, but the core meaning stayed. Whether during times of strong rule or foreign influence, the idea that intimacy belonged inside order did not disappear. It adapted without breaking. New fashions and words arrived, yet family bonds remained central. Sex continued to be understood through marriage, fertility, and balance rather than through secrecy or guilt. The lack of heavy moral fear around the body allowed people to speak of love and desire without treating them as dangerous. There were limits and laws, but there was not the same sense that the body itself was a problem. This difference shaped daily life. Bathing, dressing, and caring for the body were normal acts, not hidden ones. Intimacy grew from this comfort with physical existence. Memory carried these patterns forward. Grandparents told stories of their marriages and early years. These stories did not describe acts. They described shared effort and endurance. Intimacy became remembered as partnership rather than as momentary feeling. In this way, sexual life became part of family history rather than private secret. The future was always present in these beliefs. Children were seen as proof that life continued correctly. They learned by watching how adults lived and how couples supported one another. This made intimacy part of education without formal teaching. Values were passed down through behavior and routine rather than through rules alone. So in ancient Egypt, sex was never separate from time. It belonged to youth and to age, to life and to death, to memory and to hope. It shaped how people entered adulthood, how they formed households, and how they imagined eternity. It was guided by belief, by work, and by nature itself. And as this 10th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into stillness, we see that what mattered most was not how often or how openly people spoke of desire, but how deeply it was tied to the meaning of living. Intimacy was one of the quiet forces that joined past to present and present to future, keeping the human story moving forward along the banks of the Nile. As generations continued to live within this system of balance and continuity, intimacy also became linked to ideas of personal honor and social duty. A man and woman who formed a household were expected to protect not only each other, but also the reputation of their family line. Their bond was watched quietly by relatives and neighbors, not through direct inspection, but through the signs of harmony or disorder that appeared in daily life. A peaceful home, healthy children, and steady work showed that intimacy was fulfilling its role within society. The idea of self-control mattered as much as desire. Egyptian wisdom texts advised people to avoid excess in all things, including pleasure. This did not mean pleasure was rejected. It meant that it was meant to exist within limits, just like food and drink. Too much of anything was believed to disturb Ma'at, the balance that kept the world stable. Sexual life was therefore part of moral teaching, not as a danger, but as something that needed calm guidance. Religious festivals continued to provide moments when desire and joy were openly acknowledged. Songs and dances celebrated youth, beauty, and attraction. These public expressions did not describe physical acts. but they recognized the feelings that led to union. In this way, society allowed desire to be seen without allowing disorder to grow from it. Intimacy remained tied to celebration rather than to secrecy. Household space shaped behavior in practical ways. Many homes had only a few rooms, and daily activities happened close together. Privacy came from timing rather than from walls. Night brought quiet and separation from work. It was during these hours that closeness naturally appeared. This rhythm made intimacy feel like part of rest and renewal, rather than something separate from daily survival. Illness and injury affected relationships deeply. When one partner became weak, the other often took on more work. Medical texts show concern for women's health during pregnancy and after birth, suggesting that intimacy was not meant to bring harm. Care and patience were part of closeness, especially when the body was vulnerable. In this way, sex was linked to responsibility as much as to feeling. Differences in wealth continued to shape experience. Rich families could afford separate rooms and better food, giving them more comfort. Poor families shared space and slept close together, sometimes with children nearby. Yet both lived under the same ideas of order and family. Comfort changed the surface of intimacy, but not its meaning. Whether in large houses or small ones, closeness belonged inside marriage and household life. Foreign ideas slowly entered Egypt through trade and rule, but they did not replace older beliefs quickly. New words and customs appeared, yet fertility gods and family traditions remained powerful. Even when rulers spoke different languages, the ordinary rhythm of home life stayed Egyptian. Intimacy continued to be understood through the same link to land, gods, and continuity. Memory of ancestors strengthened these patterns. Families honored those who came before them, believing that the dead watched over the living. To form a household and raise children was to continue the work of ancestors. Sexual life thus became part of honoring the past. It was not only for the present couple, but for those who had lived before and those who would come after. Teaching of these values remained gentle. There were no public lessons about the body. Instead, children learned through daily scenes of care and cooperation. They saw how parents shared food and work. They saw how quarrels were settled and how peace returned. From this, they learned where closeness belonged and what it was meant to serve. As time moved forward, the language of love and union stayed calm and natural. Poets wrote of meeting beside water or under trees. These images placed desire inside the landscape rather than inside secrecy. Intimacy felt like part of the world's beauty, not something separate from it. So sex in ancient Egypt was shaped by honor, moderation, and memory. It was guided by belief in balance and by respect for family order. It did not seek to break rules, but to live within them. It followed the rhythm of work and rest, youth and age, life and death. And as this 11th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into quiet reflection, we see that what truly mattered was not the moment of union itself, but the place it held within a long chain of living. Intimacy linked individuals to families, families to ancestors, and ancestors to the gods. In this way, it became one of the steady forces that kept Egyptian life moving forward through centuries of sun, river, and time. Over many centuries, these quiet ideas about intimacy became so familiar that people no longer thought of them as special rules. They were simply part of how life worked. A child grew up, formed a household, and continued the line. This path was not seen as a choice, so much as a natural movement through time. Sexual life fit into this path as one step among many, alongside work, worship, and care for family. It did not stand out as separate or secret. It rested inside the larger story of becoming an adult and building a place in the world. Work and intimacy were closely connected because most labor happened near the home. Fields, workshops, and cooking spaces were often close together. Husbands and wives shared long days of effort. By night, their closeness felt like a return to unity after hours of separation by tasks. This made intimacy part of recovery and renewal, rather than excitement alone. The body was tired, the house was quiet, and closeness felt like a way to restore strength for the next day. The calendar also shaped relationships. Certain days were seen as lucky or unlucky for important actions. Couples paid attention to these ideas when planning unions or hoping for children. This belief did not come from strict law, but from tradition and observation. It added another layer of meaning to intimacy, linking it to time and destiny rather than to impulse alone. Pregnancy strengthened the bond between partners in visible ways. A woman carrying a child was treated with special care. Amulets were tied around her body. Prayers were spoken for her safety. The man's role as protector became clearer as he worked to provide food and shelter. Intimacy thus led directly into shared responsibility. It moved from private closeness into public duty. Childbirth itself was seen as both dangerous and sacred. Goddesses connected to birth were called upon for help. Women gathered around the mother to support her. When a child survived, the event was celebrated as proof that the household and the gods were in harmony. Sexual life, in this sense, reached its meaning through the arrival of new life rather than through the act itself. Loss also shaped how intimacy was understood. Not all pregnancies ended in healthy births. Disease and accidents took many lives. When a child died, couples sought comfort in one another and in belief. They did not see such loss as proof that intimacy was wrong, but as part of the uncertain world they lived in. This made closeness both hopeful and fragile at the same time. The idea of respect between partners remained central. A household that functioned well was admired. Quarrels were expected, but long conflict was seen as a sign that balance had been broken. Wisdom texts encouraged calm speech and patience inside marriage. These writings did not focus on desire, they focused on behavior and peace. Sexual life was therefore shaped by character as much as by feeling. As children grew, they saw these patterns repeated. They learned that closeness belonged with duty and care. They saw that affection could exist alongside hard work. This made intimacy seem ordinary rather than mysterious. It was part of the same world as farming and worship. Foreign contact continued to add small changes in custom, but the heart of Egyptian belief stayed the same. Fertility gods were still honored. Marriage still formed the center of family life. Even when new rulers came, the old patterns inside homes remained strong. This shows how deeply intimacy was tied to everyday living rather than to political power. In old age, people looked back on their lives with their partners as part of their story. They remembered not moments of passion, but years of cooperation. Tomb images of elderly couples sitting together suggest this quiet pride. Their closeness was shown as something that had lasted, not something that had flared and vanished. The hope of reunion after death continued to give meaning to these bonds. To lie beside a loved one in a tomb was to believe that the connection would not be lost. Intimacy thus crossed the boundary between life and death, becoming part of how people imagined eternity. So sex in ancient Egypt remained steady and grounded. It was shaped by work, by time, by belief, and by family. It did not belong to secrecy or fear. It belonged to continuity. It helped build households, raise children, and link generations. And as this 12th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that what truly defined these relationships was not the act itself, but the world around it. Intimacy was one thread in a wide fabric of life, woven together with river, land, gods, and family. It moved quietly through centuries, helping people feel that their lives were part of something lasting and meaningful. In this long pattern of life beside the Nile, intimacy also shaped how people understood patience and endurance. Relationships were not imagined as quick or dramatic changes, but as slow journeys that lasted many years. A couple's bond was built through shared seasons of work, shared hunger during poor harvests, and shared relief when the river rose well. Sexual life existed inside this long road of experience. It was not separate from struggle. It was one of the ways people stayed connected while facing it. Silence played an important role in these relationships. Egyptians did not record personal feelings in great detail the way later cultures would. Instead, emotion was expressed through simple images and actions. A hand held in art, a couple seated close in a tomb scene, or a short line of poetry about meeting by the water all carried meaning. Intimacy was shown through closeness rather than explanation. This made it feel natural and calm, part of ordinary existence rather than something needing constant words. Daily routine continued to shape when and how closeness appeared. Work began early, often before sunrise, and ended when light faded. Evenings were short and quiet, the house filled with the smell of cooked grain and oil lamps. In these moments of rest, partners turned toward each other not for excitement but for comfort. Intimacy became part of recovery from the day's labor, like sleep and food. Responsibility toward children strengthened these bonds. Once children were born, intimacy was no longer only about two people. It became about maintaining peace for the sake of the household. Quarrels were settled more quickly. Effort was made to keep stability. The presence of children turned desire into duty in a gentle way, shaping behavior without harsh rule. Festivals and holy days added a different tone to relationships. During times of celebration, clothing was cleaner, perfumes were used more freely, and music filled the air. These moments allowed people to remember beauty and attraction beyond work and survival. Desire appeared in dance and song rather than in open display. This balance between labor and celebration kept intimacy from becoming only a task. The wisdom of elders guided young couples. Older men and women advised patience, calm speech, and loyalty. Their advice was not about technique or passion. It was about keeping harmony. They taught that a peaceful household pleased the gods and protected children. Sexual life was therefore shaped by example more than by instruction. Travel and separation tested relationships. Men who worked far from home or joined expeditions were away for long periods. Their return was marked by reunion and renewed closeness. These moments carried emotional weight because absence made connection feel more precious. Intimacy was not constant. It came and went with movement and labor. Art continued to support these values by showing couples together in daily scenes rather than in dramatic poses. They are shown sharing food, standing side by side, or resting together. These images suggest that closeness was part of ordinary time, not only special moments. Sexual life was not isolated from cooking, working, or praying. It lived beside them. Illness and age changed the shape of intimacy again. Strength faded, bodies slowed, yet companionship remained. An older couple did not lose their bond because desire changed. Instead, closeness took the form of shared memory and mutual care. This shows that intimacy was understood as something that grew and shifted rather than disappeared. The hope of continued union after death remained strong. Tomb texts wishing for reunion and peace show that relationships were believed to matter beyond the body. Intimacy was therefore part of how people imagined eternity. A life shared on earth was expected to continue in another form beyond it. Through all of this, sex in ancient Egypt remained calm and woven into the larger pattern of living. It was shaped by time, by work, by belief, and by care for family. It did not seek to break order. It helped sustain it. And as this 13th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into quiet reflection, we see that closeness was not treated as a sudden spark, but as a steady flame. It warmed households through years of effort and loss. It linked one season to the next and one generation to another. In this way, intimacy became part of the long story of human life beside the Nile, moving gently forward with the river and the sun. As this way of life continued across centuries, intimacy also shaped how people understood duty to the wider community. A household was not only important for itself, it was important because it supported the village and the land. Couples who raised children added workers to the fields and temples. In this sense, sexual life was connected to the strength of the whole society. It helped maintain the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and worship that kept Egypt alive. Intimacy was therefore not only personal, it was part of the nation's quiet survival. Public behavior reflected these values. Couples did not show physical closeness openly in streets or markets, not because it was sinful, but because public space was meant for order and work. Affection belonged inside the home or in symbolic form in art and ritual. This separation between public calm and private closeness helped maintain respect and stability. People understood where each part of life belonged. The language of religion continued to support this balance. Gods and goddesses were described as families, not as solitary beings. Stories spoke of divine pairs who created life and protected the land. These myths did not describe physical acts. They described union and result. In this way, human intimacy was placed inside a sacred story without being made into spectacle. What mattered was creation, protection, and continuity. In daily life, small gestures carried meaning. A shared cup of beer, a piece of bread offered by one partner to another, or a place made on a mat beside the hearth all signaled closeness. These actions were quiet and ordinary. They did not draw attention, but they built connection. Sexual life was part of this chain of gestures rather than something standing alone. When conflict appeared, it was handled through family and local authority. Elders listened. Agreements were made. The goal was not punishment, but restoration of harmony. This shows that intimacy was treated as something worth protecting rather than something to be controlled through fear. Order was restored by bringing people back into balance with each other. The movement of time slowly changed how people remembered youth. Older couples spoke of their early years not in terms of desire, but in terms of building a home. Their memories focused on the first child, the first harvest together, and the first house they shared. Intimacy became part of these stories without being named directly. It lived inside the memory of shared beginnings. Art continued to reflect this view. Couples were carved in stone with calm expressions, standing or sitting side by side. Their bodies touched lightly, showing unity without display. These images were meant to last forever, showing that the bond itself was what mattered most. The act that formed the bond was less important than the lasting shape of the bond. Nature remained a constant guide. The rising and falling of the Nile, the growth of crops, and the movement of stars all suggested cycles of union and renewal. People understood their own lives through these patterns. Sexual life followed the same idea of return and repetition. It was part of the cycle that turned children into parents and parents into ancestors. Periods of peace strengthened these customs, and periods of trouble tested them. During famine or war, households became more careful. Children were planned with caution. Remedies were used to delay birth when food was scarce. This shows that intimacy responded to reality. It did not ignore danger. It adjusted to it. The belief in the afterlife continued to shape behavior. Couples hoped to be reunited beyond death. Tombs were prepared with images and texts that showed husband and wife together. This hope gave meaning to closeness in life. To love and build a household was to prepare for eternal union. So in ancient Egypt, sex was not treated as an isolated or dramatic event. It was part of a long pattern of duty, belief, and survival. It supported family life, which supported village life, which supported the land itself. Intimacy moved quietly inside this structure, helping to keep balance between human need and cosmic order. And as this 14th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that closeness was understood as something steady and lasting. It did not seek attention. It sought continuity. It joined people to each other and to the rhythm of the world around them, shaping a way of living that endured for thousands of years beside the river that gave Egypt its life. Over the long flow of Egyptian history, intimacy also shaped how people understood patience and restraint. Desire was seen as natural, but it was expected to move within limits set by family duty and social balance. Wisdom writings advised people to guard their behavior so that harmony inside the home would not be broken. This did not mean desire was feared. It meant it was guided, like water in an irrigation channel, allowed to flow, but kept within banks so it could nourish rather than destroy. The daily presence of neighbors and relatives meant that personal life was never completely hidden. Homes stood close together. Courtyards were shared. Sounds of work and rest carried easily through walls. Because of this, couples learned to express closeness quietly and with care. Intimacy belonged to the rhythm of night, when lamps were low and the village settled into sleep. This made sexual life feel like part of rest, rather than part of display. Seasonal labor continued to shape relationships. During planting and harvest, energy was spent on the fields. Bodies were tired, and evenings were short. During flood season, when work slowed, time inside the home increased. These shifts created natural changes in closeness without formal rules. The land itself set the pace of human union, just as it set the pace of work and hunger. Belief in protection also guided behavior. Amulets linked to fertility and health were worn close to the skin. These were not only for pregnancy, they were signs that closeness needed guarding from illness and misfortune. In this way, intimacy was treated as something valuable and fragile, deserving care rather than risk. Differences between city and village life shaped custom without changing meaning. In large towns, crowds and noise reduced privacy, and households relied more on timing than on space. In villages, distance between homes allowed more quiet. Yet in both places the same idea remained. Closeness belonged within household bonds and supported family order. Environment changed practice, but not purpose. Foreign soldiers and traders brought other habits. But Egyptian homes remained guided by older ideas. Even when rulers came from outside lands, ordinary families continued to follow traditions passed down for generations. Intimacy remained linked to children, to marriage, and to hope for the future rather than to novelty. Music and poetry continued to give voice to attraction without turning it into spectacle. Songs spoke of meeting beside water or under shade. These images did not describe bodies. They described feeling and place. Desire was framed as movement toward union, rather than as action alone. This kept intimacy inside the world of nature and beauty. The passing of years made these patterns feel natural. People did not question why households mattered, or why children were prized. They felt these truths through daily experience. Sexual life did not appear as a problem to solve. It appeared as a path already walked by ancestors and expected to be walked again by the young. In moments of crisis, such as disease or famine, these ideas were tested. Couples delayed births and relied on remedies to avoid hardship. This shows that intimacy was practical as well as emotional. It adjusted to danger rather than ignoring it. Survival and closeness were linked, not opposed. Old age brought another form of union. Desire softened into shared memory and care. Partners who had worked and raised children together sat quietly in the evening, bound more by history than by urgency. Tomb images of elderly couples show this calm connection. Their closeness was not about beginnings, but about endurance. Death did not end this bond in belief. Funerary texts and images show husband and wife side by side hoping for reunion. The idea that relationships continued beyond life gave weight to every shared year. Intimacy became part of eternity, not only of youth. Through all these changes of season, class, and age, sex in ancient Egypt remained part of a larger system. It supported households, which supported villages, which supported the land. It was guided by belief in balance and by respect for continuity. It did not seek to stand out. It sought to belong. And as this 15th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into calm, we see that what truly defined these relationships was steadiness. Closeness was shaped by time, by work, and by care. It moved quietly through generations, helping people feel that their lives were joined to one another and to the enduring order of the world beside the Nile. As these customs continued across many lifetimes, intimacy also became tied to memory and storytelling inside families. Grandparents spoke of how they had met, how their household began, and how children slowly filled their home. These stories were not about desire in detail. They were about beginnings and endurance. In this way, Sexual life became part of family history rather than private secret. It was remembered as the moment when a new branch of the family tree started to grow. Daily language reflected this quiet importance. People spoke of making a house rather than simply forming a couple. The words they used showed that union was understood as construction, not as escape. To join with another person was to build something that would last beyond a single season. Intimacy was therefore linked to effort and patience rather than to sudden feeling alone. The tools of everyday life carried this meaning as well. Beds, mats, and simple furniture were placed inside the home with care. These objects were not only for rest, they symbolized shared space. A place prepared for two people to sleep was also a place prepared for trust. The arrangement of a house showed how closeness was meant to fit into ordinary life without drama or display. The presence of children changed this space again. A mat, once shared by two, became a place where infants were held and comforted. Night was no longer only for rest and union. It became a time for care and protection. In this way, intimacy passed naturally into parenthood. It did not disappear. It transformed into responsibility and shared vigilance. Religion continued to support this view by linking human households with divine ones. Gods were shown caring for their children and protecting their partners. These images were not focused on acts of creation, but on the results of union, family, and stability. Human intimacy followed this pattern, aiming not at spectacle but at lasting connection. Travelers who visited Egypt often noticed the calm way families lived together. They saw couples working side by side and resting close together. This closeness did not appear dramatic to them. It appeared practical and steady. It suggested that relationships were part of survival rather than rebellion against rules. The rhythm of day and night continued to guide behavior. Light belonged to work and public order. Darkness belonged to rest and private life. Intimacy fitted into this pattern as naturally as sleep. It did not need special time set aside. It arrived when the house was quiet and the body was ready to rest. The presence of illness or danger changed this rhythm, but it did not erase it. When disease spread, couples became more cautious. When food was scarce, births were delayed. These choices show that sexual life was guided by awareness of the world outside the home. It did not ignore reality. It responded to it. Even when foreign rulers changed laws and language, the habits inside homes remained Egyptian. Parents taught children the same ways of living. Marriage still formed the center of adulthood. Children still marked success. Intimacy still belonged to family order rather than to public life. This shows how deeply rooted these beliefs were, surviving changes of power and time. Old age brought reflection. People who had spent decades with one partner saw their union as proof of balance achieved. Their bodies weakened, but their bond remained. Tomb scenes of elderly couples seated together show this calm unity. Their closeness was no longer about beginning life, but about completing it together. The hope of reunion after death strengthened this feeling. To lie beside a loved one in a tomb was to believe that connection would continue. Intimacy was thus not only part of earthly existence, it was part of the journey beyond it. So in ancient Egypt, sex was woven into the long story of building, raising, and remembering. It was shaped by work, by belief, by time, and by care. It did not seek attention. It sought continuity. It moved quietly from youth to age, from love to memory, from life to eternity. And as this 16th part of our slow walk through intimacy in ancient Egypt settles into stillness, we see that what mattered most was not the act itself, but the path it helped create. Through closeness, households were formed. Through households, society endured. And through this endurance, people felt that their lives were part of something greater than a single moment beside the river. In the quiet end of this long story, intimacy in ancient Egypt can be understood as something steady rather than dramatic. It did not rise and fall with sudden changes of fashion or law. It moved forward with the river, the seasons, and the generations of families who lived beside them. What people shared with one another inside their homes was shaped by work, belief, and time. Desire was not separated from duty, and pleasure was not separated from survival. Everything belonged to the same pattern of living. A couple's bond was measured not by how loudly it was shown, but by how long it lasted. Years spent farming the same fields, raising children under the same roof, and praying to the same gods created a kind of closeness that did not need display. Sexual life became part of this long companionship. It was one of the ways people stayed connected as bodies aged and responsibilities grew. What began in youth as attraction slowly turned into trust and shared memory. The land itself continued to shape these bonds. When the Nile rose and the fields rested, families stayed close indoors. When the waters fell and work returned, time grew shorter and bodies grew tired. Intimacy followed this movement, coming and going with the rhythm of labor and rest. It did not fight against nature, it followed it. Belief in order and ma'at kept relationships calm rather than wild. People were taught that too much of anything could disturb balance. This included anger, pride, and pleasure. Sex was therefore guided into a place where it could strengthen the household instead of breaking it. It supported children, cooperation, and peace inside the home. In this way, it served life rather than standing apart from it. Even when Egypt passed through times of trouble, when rulers changed and foreign ideas arrived, the habits inside ordinary houses remained much the same. Men and women still formed households. Children were still welcomed as signs of continuity. Love poems were still copied and remembered. The meaning of intimacy stayed rooted in family and belief rather than in novelty. At the end of life, people looked back on their unions as part of what gave their years purpose. They did not speak of single moments, but of shared journeys. Tombs carved with images of husband and wife sitting together show that what mattered most was not the beginning of the bond, but its endurance. Intimacy became memory, and memory became hope for reunion beyond death. So what sex was really like in ancient Egypt cannot be understood only by looking for hidden acts or secret meanings. It must be understood by looking at how people lived together, how they raised children, and how they imagined eternity. It was part of a system that linked body and belief, home and land, life and afterlife. And as our slow walk through this ancient world comes gently to an end, we leave behind not a picture of excess or silence, but a picture of balance. Intimacy was one quiet thread woven into the larger fabric of Egyptian life. It helped families grow, helped society endure, and helped people feel that their lives were connected to something lasting beneath the sun and beside the river. If you enjoyed this calm journey into the past, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe for more slow and gentle walks through history.